Hi, welcome to the Louise Jannetta YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe if you want to be notified for any future videos. And today is the demonstration of the watercolour and ink series, and this one is how watercolour and inks can be used to define water, all the ripples and eddies and beautiful abstract mark making and line that water offers. I'll be using the riverbank one to demonstrate the washes and the layering of different glazes that you can put on, and I'll be using the duck doodle image to demonstrate the highly patterned abstract marks that all the ripples and movement in the water make. Really good for these mediums. There will be a PDF of both of the images in the description below, a PDF link, so you can use the image as you like. The riverbank one has a good demonstration about how to put washes on, and I'll do that really quickly, speed it up. Okay, good luck. You can see here where I've combined drawing in pebbles and things, painting the pebbles, painting the background like I did with the foliage in the fox and pheasant, but then also doing these watermarks over the top of it, so it looks like the water is translucent. It all becomes a pattern, and your brain fills in the information and makes up the experience out of things that you've experienced in the past. I'll show you how to do this. Again, it's the pen and ink drawing in the stones, and then you allow spaces for the watercolour and the inks to make these lovely marks. Right, I'm going to be doing these two images, the ducks in the water, and I'm going to be looking at the way that you can pull colour around in patterns. You draw these rocks and things in non-soluble acrylic inks, and on top of that you use the watercolour and or acrylic inks. But the idea of using the acrylic inks here is that they are not soluble once they're dry, so they'll stay in place. You can use watercolour techniques, you can sprinkle them with salt to remove pigment, but once they're dry they are no longer soluble, so you can then work over them with glazes. And in this case I am letting the watercolour or the pigment, either watercolour or acrylic inks, to merge through the shapes I make with the water, so that the water tension carries the colour, carries the pigment. In this one it's a riverbank scene, and I am going to have a look at the glazes that create solid colour in the background. They will either be watercolour or acrylic, because once that's dry you can leave it, and then on top of that you put glazes and patterning, both again in the watercolour or the acrylic inks, but again you're allowing patterning to happen, which you can then glaze over the top of, so you are using the non-soluble acrylic inks to sit there permanently dry when they're dry, and then to work over them with glazes on top. So for instance here in this bottom left hand corner, again I've got little pebbles and things drawn in with the acrylic inks first, so that the water looks translucent and you can see the bottom of the stream. Okay, I hope you enjoy. I am very quickly drawing in the edge of the riverbank, but without keeping it too straight, and just a few simple trees, if you think about the lovely negatives that you're going to use, because that creates interest. And then I'm going to draw in the leaves. The idea here is that it's very similar to the fox and pheasant image, so these leaves are going to be brighter than the background behind them. It helps to create the depths and the dynamics of the picture. You can see that I've drawn in darker acrylic ink, which will dry non-soluble, which I can then glaze over with translucent inks. When drawing the leaves, you want the board to be flat because you don't want the pigment to run. And this is just when you start developing up lovely little mark making and leaves. And the idea is just to have lovely erratic leaves and ferns. So clumsy, it's beyond belief. And then in the other colours, just while you're at it and before the whole thing dries, just draw in a few stones. Remember to sit them in front of each other, and this is just going to be the little pebbles at the bottom of the stream that will just be slightly visible through the water. And this colour will just dry solid because it's in acrylic inks. While you leave that to dry, you get your pigment in your palette. And I like acrylic blue, and I make up a wash already that I've got enough to do the whole of the picture, so the sky and the water. And the idea is that the water is reflecting the sky, but within that water you will see I've got a lot of different colours. There is a slight yellow, there's a slight pinky purple, but the first coat, don't worry too much about it. You just want it to get it on, and you want the initial darks up by the undergrowth under the bank. So make sure you've got your colours that you really like ready. But before I do the wash on the painting, I'm just quickly going to show you how to get a flat wash. You position the paper so that it's at a 45-degree angle. You have your pigment already mixed, and you get a clean paintbrush so that you don't drag any of the solid pigment through your wash. You start at the top with a pool of the water at the top, and then you keep it wet, but you drag that pool down so your actual brush is pretty wet and full of the pigment, and you pull it across, allowing the pool of pigment to sit at the bottom. As it goes down, the pigment is absorbed into the paper, and you get a nice solid wash of colour that's very, very even. If you start doing, like, if you add it more like this, then you will have runs and stuff in it. But of course sometimes you want that, depending on how you want it. But the way to get it to run flat is to tip it up and let the pigment sit to the bottom. So to do the sky, I'm just going to start at the top. The board is angled at about 45 degrees, and I do as I said. So you start your pooling, but just go to the edge of the tree and just bring it down, bring your pool down. Now I'm going to stop so that I can get a bit of some landscape in, and do the same on the other side. So get your pool in, bring it to the bottom, and then pull it across. Now I also want a couple of little leaves, so I'm getting a dry paintbrush and I'm just lifting out some of that pigment. Or you can get a yellow and bung a couple of yellow drops in at this point, and they would melt into the pigment so that it looks like they're in the distance. Right, keep going, and maybe leave some white spaces at this point so that I can put in some brighter leaves, and the luminosity of the white paper can come through. Taking that down a bit further, just because it looks nice on this one. Make sure there's pigment into that bit that you're bringing down. but don't let too much pigment pool because it'll show. But I just want a few areas where I'm going to leave white. So I'm now even going to pull the pigment through those spaces and round those spaces. I want some landscape in there showing through. I'm just going to pick up a little bit of yellow or green, or I want a landscape that melts into the background a bit, because then it takes it off to the distance. If there's a sharp line, it looks like it's too present, too in the foreground and not in the background. If the whole thing fades back, it looks like it's disappearing off into the distance. I just want a few melted yellows in there too, while the blue is still wet enough to take it. And in fact, it's already dried. That's amazing, it's this weather. It doesn't matter. And this lovely yellow too. So funny, because I'm there telling you what to do, and then I mess with it so much. So I want to know what sort of darks I'm going to put under here, and I have mixed some darks here, and I've also got a couple of browns and things that I like here, some quite darks. So I've got colours already mixed, and I've got my blue wash that I did before that's the same colour as the sky. So I'm going to be pretty quick, and I'm going to start off with a wash as I would have done with the sky. So I keep a pool to the bottom. I want it pretty flat, and again I don't want a solid edge to the underside of the bank, because if you start doing straight lines there, it immediately doesn't look like it's nature. It looks like a technical design has had a go at it. So I'm just pulling that through. It's a bit grey that, but it doesn't matter because it's going to be darker. So I've started off my wash. Now then I pull it through, keeping a nice wet edge to the front edge of it. And see how the pigment is dripping through it. Just keep it nice and wet. I wanted this to be pretty flat, this first coat. So just make sure there's enough pigment in there. You can just see the pigment washing down through it. Just make sure there's enough in it. Now I also want a bit of orange in there. It's because I love that colour. So I'm just pulling in some orange with it as well. And trying not to let the blue corrupt the orange too much. And not worrying about it too much. I also want a bit of pink. I wanted a bit of yellow in the front, which is partly the... Right, now I'm hoping that it hasn't dried up too much at the top. Right, the next bit I'm going to try and get stuff a dark into this underside. I want it to have lovely pure colour, so I'll start with a nice blue and start to think about leaving shapes that you want to come through. Now I want to remember that this is the beginnings of your eddying water, so think about the shapes you're going to start creating to make your water eddy nicely, and the colours you want for it to do that, and leave some of the leaves that are hanging over light because you want to make them stand out at the end. So these are all watercolours, allowing the water to and the glazes to build up, and the pigment still probably moves a bit, but not too much. It is drying very quickly, this water. While that part's drying, I'm just quickly going to work on this part. And in this instance, I'm going to put some actual acrylic inks so that the whole thing dries solid, and do it between the rocks. So we've got some nice depths. And again, let the pigment seep through these shapes. It's really supposed to be adding sort of interest. And then when this is dry, you see, the pigment will stay there, whereas the glazes that I'm going to put on top will move around. So I've just got a yellow and a brown. and I'm just suggesting pebbles and stuff in the bottom of the water. We just want the odd area of sort of dark. Now it's just sort of having some faith and letting it dry out a bit. While I can, I'm just going to pick out some of the darks just in the underside here. I'm doing it with a fairly clean dry brush so that the marks are sharp. I don't want to lose I want it all to be too watery. I want some lines to be nice and sharp. So there's a nice contrast between the sharp and the watery effect. I'm just going to sharpen some of these bits up and also add a bit more colour. So I've got some more acrylic ink and I'm sort of following the lines that have already been made by the shadowing. Oops, I dropped that, but that's nice all the same. Using acrylic ink so that it stays in place on top of the glaze that you've put on there, and it's just a question of pulling out lovely little eddies and flows in the water. I've got a purple here and I'm going to let colours drip through it. I'm going to do it with a pen and ink and with my paintbrush. It's surprising how abstract these can be. And I'm letting the colour flow through lines that are already on there, and the wetness that's on there, and the water tension of what's on there. The idea is just to build up pattern and texture that work for the image. And yeah, go over your lovely rocks and things, because that will work too. Just really how fluid and fun these lines can be. You can make some of these more solid shapes and some of them more linear. I've got more detail up in this top left hand corner, just where the eddies are perhaps hitting rocks or something, so enjoy. Just pull out these lines. I'm doing this at a funny angle, so it's not as good as I could be. Sorry about that, but it's so that you can see the image. I'm not going to do too much more on that. The next thing I'm going to show you is the trees, and again I'm going to be doing them from a funny angle. So the trees I have covered in the beech tree one. Take a lovely bit of grey through and put enough water on so that there's a fluidity to it all, so that the pigments that you add after are just going to flow through it. I've got a lovely grey watercolour here, and leave the areas for where you want the trees to come through, and then you just place pigment on it and the pigment will move across. I'm just going to use grey and a lovely viridian green that I like, and honestly that's all I do, because otherwise it becomes too competitive with all the movement and stuff that's going on in the water. And then if you want a darker pigment in it, so that we define a lighter and a darker side, bring a bit in while it's still wet so it can still move across the pigment, so that it can still move across the water that's there, but let it move in the water. Try not to make it move. Try to let it move of its own accord, because it will create much more interesting patterns if you do. You can tip it over to one side as well. Now that it's dry, you have to think about the reflections of the trees, and they go in the opposite way to how the tree is lying on land. So reflections go that way, that way, that way, that way and that way. You just have to remember that when you're doing it. It's quite tricky. I have mixed up some lovely dirty green, and I'm going to start pulling the actual reflections through the water. So I get a nice square nice square paintbrush, the same sort of thickness as the actual tree, and then I start to actually make lovely reflective lines come off and break them, because of course they'd be broken by the water, and then just think that it might have a branch off it or something, and play with the shapes you can make with it and fade it off. So that one, now this one, which is going to go that way and then the other way, so pull it through from underneath the, and again keep it all fluid so it's pretty much not described, it's just suggested at. And you can leave lovely blobs and things, because of course the water would do that in any case. And then the smaller trees, I'll use a smaller paintbrush, but these lines are so beautiful and so much fun to do. The water's moving more there, so break the lines up a bit. And here the next thing to do is to get a colour and add the darks and put it on the edge that's the darker side of the tree. Put the colours on the edge of the reflection and allow it to blend. When the initial mark made for the reflection is wet, the darks will just move across the wet surface in the surface tension of the water. Take it dark onto the underside. If you feel that, which I do, that is sort of taking over the darks that are underneath the edge, just bang out a few more darks on the underside of the edge, because again it would be reflecting greens and browns from the undergrowth. I have to admit, I like the yellow in it a bit, so I'm just gonna, I do love yellow, so I'm just gonna sort of bring in a bit of yellow just because I want it to look like it's reflecting the landscape as well, and also some of the leaves. It brings the two halves of the painting together. Take that round there just to make that more defined, that one. Just gonna add a few more leaves, a bit more definition to the leaves at the top. I just want it to sort of sit better in with the rest of the picture really. But again, not too much, and keep the definition forward and the less defined bits in the background so that your eye's got something to follow. Right, that's about it, because otherwise you get too carried away with it. So I'm doing both ends of the painting at the same time just to keep things balanced really. I do actually want a bit of ochre in there as well. And from here it's just a question of bringing in colour and glazing over the drawing, filling in the leaves, taking out the whites, and getting the darks in on the underside of the leaves. Again, maybe using a dried brush so that the marks you make are nice and sharp. Put the darks in first and then put the lighter glazes on the surfaces of the leaves at the top. Well, that's it. I've filled it all in now. That's finished. For the water on the duck-doodle image, I'm just going to roughly show you the sort of principles of doing it, and then you can use the PDF image that's in the link below to develop the technique as you like. And it can be applied on all sorts of things to sort of experience that you use in other applications. For instance, I use it with oil painting. That's just an image where I've used glazing on top of oils, and the same sort of doodling patterning to create the water in oils. Hope it's helpful. So you draw in a load of stones, making sure that you sit ones on top of each other and vary the shapes of them so that there's interest. And some of them have sides like so. Some of them sit in front of each other. Okay, and vary the mark that you're making and the colour of the ink, because that just adds a bit more interest. And then you simply fill in the background with a darker colour and then glaze over the stones in a lighter colour. I should wait for that to dry, but I'm going to drop stuff in now. So I've got an ink here and I'm just going to fill in the spaces and perhaps leave a few as well. And again, try and remember to add colour in with this bit because it just makes it nicer. and more interesting. Don't just use the one tone. And I've used the actual ink to do this because it's light fast, and I'm probably going to add colour over the top of it as well. And then when it comes to the edges of it, you can start thinking about what would happen as the water came trickling over it. So you get both the water and the stone and start the pattern that comes in. And because water is so liquidy and so interesting, it's really, you're playing as much as anything. I mean, it's really lovely to practice this if you've got the chance as well. You get some beautiful effects as the different colours blend into one another. So the next bit is just to add the colour to the stones, and again, don't leave them just one colour. You know, let them have some life in them, and you don't have to worry too much about keeping within the lines. You want all the white gone. You want them to stay whiter than, you know, lighter than what's underneath, and vary the colours of the ones next to each other, just because it sort of helps to see them. And don't worry about it being too well defined, because we'll probably go over this again with some water yet. It is surprising what sort of colours stones are underneath the water. So I've got lovely rust reds in there, emerald greens and greys. Oh, and ochres. Ochre's nice, these pebbles underneath the water. Oh, and a lovely brown. Wow, what's it called? It is sepia. With that on the black, making a nice grey. And you can put a few bits in there. And now it's just to finish things off a bit. Fill in all the stones. Make sure they're contrasting colours and tones to keep the stones individually recognisable. Fill in some of the darks, give the extra depths to corners and crevices. And you can also use spray to give the stones texture. So just get a brush covered in pigment, something with hard bristles, and spray the stones. And the next bit would be just to add in the last bits of patterning and rippling by adding lines of colour, blues and greens, and dropping contrasting or deeper hues which you simply allow to bleed through the water tension of the shapes that you've created. So the colour blends of its own accord. Add a few darks again just to give depths, and then maybe glaze over a few of the existing marks, and that's about it. Thank you for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, and that way you'll be notified when I upload anything in the future. I hope it's all of some use. Thank you for watching, and see you again. Bye.